I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from across Ukraine, discuss the potential death of Western democracy, and we speak about the challenges and issues facing women in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 31st of May, 2 years and 98 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, historian Dr. Thomas Clausen, Project Kesher CEO Karyn Gershon, and CEO of Project Kesher Ukraine and the Women's Opportunity Fund of Ukraine, Vlada Nedak. I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. Let's start in Russia, in the Krasnodar region. That's the landmass east of the Sea of Azov and Crimea, where the Ukrainian military have claimed to hit an oil terminal at the Russian port of Kavkaz. The military reported explosions at the site and is working to verify the damage from the attack carried out with Ukrainian-made Neptune missiles. Ukrainian drones also struck another oil depot in the Krasnodar region, the statement said. This again is from the Ukrainian military. Continuing the theme of relentless strikes against infrastructure, the Ukrainian military also said, quote, Russia's modern and effective air defense system once again proved powerless against our missiles and unmanned systems and failed to protect important facilities used for logistics and supply. For its part, the Russian Defense Ministry said on Telegram that its air defense system destroyed 5 missiles and 29 drones targeting Krasnodar. According to local Russian officials, falling drone debris sparked a fire at an oil depot in the Temryuk district, damaging several tanks filled with fuel and injuring 2 people. Moving to Ukraine, Russian missiles have hit 3 sites in Kharkiv, killing at least 3 people and injuring 16, local officials said early on Friday. Accounts of the attack said the missiles hit a 5-story apartment block, a shop in a 3-story building, and a sewing factory. Regional Governor Olesny Hubuhov said the attacks on the city's Novobazarsky district used the double tap technique, that's delivering a second strike soon after an initial attack on a given site, deliberately targeting aid workers operating at the scene. Snyhubohov said that, according to preliminary information, S-300 missiles were used in the strike. And Kharkiv Mayor Ihor Tedakov told public broadcaster Suspilne, quote, the 3rd, 4th and 5th floors are destroyed, stairwells were destroyed, facades were destroyed. This is, of course, describing damage to the apartment building. Snyhubohov also said that at least 2 children were among those injured in the attack, which occurred at about midnight local time, and he warned that residents could still be trapped underneath the rubble left by the strike. Well, let's move to the big news of the day, and I'm sure Francis will want to touch on this as well, but, and this is our reporting here, Joe Biden has bowed to international pressure to allow Ukraine to use American weapons to strike Russian territory, after the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said, quote, the time has come to overturn the ban. According to 2 US officials, the US has given Kyiv permission to use its weapons to strike Russia for the limited purpose of defending Kharkiv. The unnamed officials insisted the US policy preventing Ukraine from using American-provided long-range missiles to strike inside Russia has not changed. One US official told Politico, quote, the president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine is able to use US weapons for counter-fire purposes in Kharkiv, so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces hitting them or preparing to hit them. Security analyst Jimmy Rushton has also said on Twitter that Zelensky's press secretary Serhiy Nikiforov has confirmed that Ukraine has received permission from the US to use American-provided weapons for strikes on targets within Russian territory in the, quote, border region with Kharkiv. Francis, as I said, will cover this in more detail, but that's a very, very significant development. Just some more news from yesterday before we go to Francis. So on Thursday, a Czech official said that Ukraine will receive 50,000 to 100,000 shells in June under a Czech-led initiative to buy ammunition for the country, largely outside Europe. Tomáš Kopecný, the Czech government envoy for Ukraine reconstruction, told reporters that Ukraine could get millions of shells if allies managed to collect the money. Quote from him, he said, "The first delivery under the umbrella of this Czech initiative will be in June, and it'll be dozens of thousands of shells, between 50 and 100. This is on the fringes of the meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Prague." Mr. Kopetsny urged further contributions, as Ukraine will need 200,000 shells a month in the next 2 years, quote, "just to make the balance vis-à-vis Russia." Finally, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has signed a bilateral security deal with Sweden. Zelensky arrived in Stockholm today for the third Nordic-Ukrainian summit, meeting Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson. He said Ukraine will sign 3 security agreements in one day, establishing predictable and long-term defence assistance and comprehensive support. This, of course, comes on the back of the huge new Swedish package of assistance for Ukraine. The details of this security bilateral are still coming through to us, so we'll go through it in more detail on Monday. And I think that's us up to date. Francis Dearnley.
Thanks, David. What an extraordinary week for news. Let's start in the United States, where, as you say, President Biden has bowed to international pressure to allow Ukraine to use American weapons to strike Russian territory after the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said the time had come to overturn the ban. We reported several days ago how the momentum was beginning to shift in Washington, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken said to be in favour of giving this permission. After that, it did only feel a matter of time. It's clear that considerable pressure was being put on the US from Kyiv, London and Riga, and for understandable reasons, of course. In military terms, it was clearly illogical for the Ukrainian army to not be permitted to fire on military targets a mere 4 kilometres away across the Russian border that were preparing to attack Kharkiv and elsewhere. But, and this is really important, it does appear there are caveats in place, however, specifically how far these Western weapons are permitted to be fired within Russia. So those who are saying this morning, well, this means now that Kyiv has been given permission to fire on the Kremlin, are not accurate. Okay, this is only permission being given to strike on those military targets that are preparing in Russia to strike on Ukraine immediately and are very, very close to the border. To clarify that point, in an interview in The Guardian, Zelensky did argue strongly that ultimately Kyiv would need to be able to use powerful long-range weapons that could still hit targets in deep Russian territory, but said that is a red line the White House has refused to lift. Now, The Guardian says Zelensky appeared relaxed and positive, but that his frustration at the delay of these permissions that have been granted very evident. He said it left the Kremlin's forces laughing at Ukraine and able to hunt its people. He also noted that Western countries at peace had different priorities at the moment and understandably did not share Ukraine's sense of existential urgency. Quote, "This means that dialogue rather than action is often the case. For us, though, time is our life," he said. "If you don't go down in a minute to a bomb shelter, you can be dead. Therefore, the attitude to time here is completely different." Now, speaking of time, we will, of course, cover in a future episode the ramifications of the Trump guilty verdict yesterday for the likelihood or not of his re-election in November, and what that may or may not mean for the shape of the war that follows, which would, of course, be enormous. But just staying on this massive development, it bears repeating, and it will come as no surprise, that Russia has warned that it will retaliate asymmetrically to any attacks that use these weapons provided by the US. Kartapolov, the head of the lower house's defense committee in Russia, said earlier today that Biden's decision would not impact the military operation in Ukraine, but there would be a response. Of course, the Kremlin has no choice but to threaten everything it can to try and deter other countries from going down this path. That's why we, of course, saw that nuclear saber rattling in the past few weeks. It'll come as no surprise to listeners that Putin's lapdog Medvedev has been threatening tactical nukes and all-out war again. But despite these threats, which many consider empty, the tide has evidently turned, and what once seemed impossible has become necessary. Even Germany, one of the most cautious countries, has confirmed that it agrees with this stance, even with regard to its own weapons. Quote from a spokesman, "We are jointly convinced that Ukraine has the right, guaranteed under international law, to defend itself against these attacks. To do so, it can also use the weapons supplied for this purpose in accordance with its international legal obligations, including those supplied by us." Now that follows President Macron of France saying at a speech in Dresden this week that the EU should double its budget and invest much more money in AI and defence. We should really have a jingle by now for whenever Macron says something like this. He is still very much perhaps the most vocal voice in Europe of the major powers on the urgency of the situation. And in that vein, the next big debate, or perhaps inevitable shift in Western policy to come, is around that question of Western troops on the ground. Not to fight necessarily, but to alleviate the burden for Ukraine with regard to training and less urgent matters behind the lines as it faces this renewed onslaught. Macron mooted the prospect, of course, and rumours swirl that Estonia is very warm to the idea. Fascinatingly, too, today, according to the Kyiv Independent, Lithuania as well is willing to send its personnel to train Ukrainian soldiers on its own soil if needed. So to quote its Prime Minister, "We've trained Ukrainian soldiers before this invasion, and this is a long-standing cooperation between our military and the Ukrainians. We train them in third countries and we train them in Lithuania. But Lithuania, if needed, maybe would train them also in Ukraine in partnership with willing countries." We are seeing, David, hugely significant debates with ramifications for Ukraine and the whole West playing out in real time. This is truly the first draft of history. Now, interestingly, just on this subject, listeners will recall that London pointed the finger at Beijing for secretly providing weapons to Moscow, something the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said publicly didn't tally with his understanding. Though I would add there have been reports for a long time that this is indeed happening for well over a year, further to China's political and economic support. Well, China's defence chief has told the US that Beijing does not provide weapons to either side of the conflict in Ukraine and that China holds an impartial position. Quote, "We have honoured our commitment not to provide weapons to either side in the conflict. In accordance with laws and regulations, we have implemented strict controls on exports of military items." That's what the Chinese spokesman said after conversations with US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin in Singapore. Interesting and not necessarily accurate, but the fact that China feels it's important to say this publicly reveals something. Now, moving on very briefly, two other stories I think are worth mentioning. I don't want us to forget what's going on in Georgia at the moment. The news, of course, that Georgian MPs voted to overturn the presidential veto on that contentious Transparency on Foreign Influence bill, often dubbed the Foreign Agents Law, sparked several weeks of protests in the capital, Tbilisi. For now, unrest seems to have died down, but opposition figures are watching very closely what other bills may be put towards the House. All of this will have a major impact, of course, in the upcoming elections in Georgia in October. This will be a key battlefield in the political fault line of Europe at the moment between Russia and the West. So we will, of course, continue to watch what goes on in Georgia very, very closely. And just to conclude with Moscow, more signs of a crackdown, Russia threatening to remove children from parents who question the war. So children have already, of course, been forced to flee the country and face jail sentences and placed in orphanages too, as the pressure piles on parents who dare to question the Kremlin, according to Amnesty International, who say the very bond between children and their parents is being shamefully exploited now to crush dissent. In this politically motivated assault on children, schools and teachers have become tools of persecution and arbitrary interference by the Russian state. Is it any surprise, given the horrors Ukrainian children have endured? Oppression is never one way. You can't do it without it corrupting the self too. That applies to people as well as nations. Now, this policy is despite the fact, of course, that young Russians are dying on an enormous scale in Ukraine. As The Guardian again reports today, there's the case of one man called Danil, a boy really, who just 4 months ago turned 18, voted for the only president he'd ever known, completed a rushed military training and was killed in Ukraine. Just 4 months. Now, he was born in 2006, which makes him the youngest known Russian casualty. And he wanted to join, apparently, which is revealing of the reality of modern Russia for people who have only ever known Putin's rule. Such is Putin's state, where stories like this, as if from the pages of history books recording the First World War, are startlingly common.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. We're delighted, first of all, to welcome back to the podcast historian Dr. Thomas Clausen, dialing in from Berlin. Thomas, you've written a fantastic essay for The Telegraph as part of our new series reflecting on the ramifications if Putin were to win this war. But before we get to that, how would you assess the atmosphere and the sense of urgency in Germany at the moment with regards to the war in Ukraine? Thomas Clausen.
Thank you very much for having me again. That's a very good question. And Francis already mentioned the most important development today, that Germany is following the US's footsteps and says that Ukraine can use German weapons to strike targets in Russia, with special reference to the activities around Kharkiv. But of course, this is only one part of the story. And the other one is, in a way, almost completely the opposite. And that is the ongoing campaign for the European Parliament elections. And there we have several parties who say that peace or creating peace is the most important topic. I think we all agree on this podcast that there's nothing else that we want at this moment than peace. But the point is, of course, that there are two very different philosophies and pursued also by different parties how this peace can be attained. And it seems to me that, in particular, the SPD, so Scholz's party, is trying to lead a peace-centric election campaign where his sort of reluctance to supply Ukraine with weapons is actually portrayed as being cautious, well-adjusted, careful. And this is, in a way, a contrast to today's decision, which seems to be following the agenda pursued, for example, by the Liberals, by the Greens, also by Conservatives, who say that supplying Ukraine with weapons is actually the best way to achieve peace in the long run.
Thomas, thank you so much for your time today. As David mentioned there, you've written an essay for us in this series that Aliona Hlivko wrote the first essay for, which Dom discussed with her earlier in the week, imagining what will happen in Europe and in the West if Putin wins. Now, your essay reflects specifically on the European political sphere. What's your central thesis about what may become of European political movements, particularly on the right, if Putin were to be successful in his full-scale invasion?
Yes, it's always very difficult to predict the future, and historians are also notoriously bad at this. But what struck me is, in a way, that one can make an argument if we accept the dreadful proposition that Putin wins in Ukraine. Then my argument is it's quite likely that this style of Russian fascism, or Russism as it has been called, would spread to Western Europe for several reasons. So the first general argument that I make is that if we look back at history, actually democracies can fall very, very quickly, especially when they think that they are secure. And the example that I give is the spring of 1940. So in preparation to this essay, I read a bit of the articles of Cato and the Guilty Men and Marc Bloch's piece on the strange defeat of France in the spring of 1940. And what struck me was that even in April 1940, so when German troops were already in Poland, there was still a discussion in London and in Paris that, well, Hitler has missed the bus. Now everyone is catching up, and there's no way that he can achieve his targets or war goals of successfully invading France. And so the phony war was very much an expression of the idea that the war that Hitler had started in conjunction with the Soviet Union could be confined to Eastern Europe. And that was, of course, a grave mistake. And only a few weeks after Neville Chamberlain made this comment about Hitler having missed the bus, the German troops were entering Paris. And this is a reminder that even though I think there's still quite an aggravating sense in Western capitals that, yes, this is all happening in Ukraine, but it will stay there. And we are not in the crosshairs of Putin. I think we should remember this lesson of history that Western democracies are in the crosshairs of Putin, and it could turn pear-shaped very quickly. And that leads me to the second part of the argument, that we must understand, a lot of people in Europe have so far understood it, but unfortunately not all policymakers, that we are facing a hybrid war, so a new type of war, where Putin is already on the attack, even in Western Europe, including, for example, murders on NATO ground. We have recently seen his shenanigans in the Baltic Sea. We know about the GPS jamming, and we know about his attempts to manipulate referenda and elections. And that's the third part and the final part of the argument, is if we have to envision a scenario of how Putin could win and how his type of fascism could spread to Western Europe, we would have to understand that he is undermining or subverting a number of opposition parties and key actors in Germany and other Western European countries. And the example that I give from my own view on Germany is that, of course, there's the AfD, which has a number of members and MPs even who've been to Russia recently, who've visited Crimea. Some of them have even visited Luhansk and Donetsk after 2014, and they were received very warmly. For example, the head of the party, Tino Kruppalla, was received very warmly last year in the Russian embassy, joining, unfortunately, also members of other opposition parties, including, ironically, the left. So you mentioned at the beginning that this is a problem of the German right, but unfortunately, Putin has succeeded in diversifying his investment. We know about the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. We know about the Left Party. And we know, unfortunately, also about the new party that split from the left, which is now led by Sarah Wagenknecht, which also campaigns on this idea that we need to stop sending weapons to Ukraine in order for peace to be finally achieved. And we all know that this type of peace would mean further war and further violence in Ukraine and possibly even in Western Europe. But that's the line of the argument, is that his support for opposition parties in Europe could mean that our internal institutions are so weakened that we are unable to defend ourselves against hybrid warfare. And then Putin would have all the incentives to gradually test the limits of Article 5 and to see what he can do in Central and Eastern Europe, potentially only stopping at the Rhine or the Channel.
Well, thank you, Thomas. And suffice to say, anyone who's finding this as interesting as I am, and I have already read the piece, can read the piece. We'll have the link in the description to this and other essays in the series. Just to pick up another thing, I think that's very interesting in your essay, Thomas, that you draw out is that on the one hand, as you say, this is the weaknesses within European politics could be caused by the war are direct, as in Putin is carrying out hybrid warfare, something that would only be extrapolated if he was able to transfer the money he's spending in Ukraine, if he were victorious, onto fighting other Western powers using that. Yes. But also there's this idea of imitation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that in other contexts too, in Europe and perhaps historically, this idea that it's actually, we could do it to ourselves. That of course, part of the appeal in the 1930s of fascism is that these figures are seen to solve problems that democracy can't solve, that the strong man suddenly becomes very appealing. And I just wonder if you can comment a little bit more about what Putin may come to represent if he is successful at a time when the West is living through a very chaotic era and democracies are not seemingly able to make a lot of change happen quickly.
I think it would, in the past decades, we have, or maybe the last 20 years, we have seen that Putin was very successful in appealing to certain strata of society who are looking exactly for this type of strongman. We all recall the images of him riding half naked on a horse. And that's, of course, appealing especially to those people who dislike parliamentary democracy, who think it's all compromises, it's all weak and corrupt and not prone to making decisive calls. He has been appealing to traditional values and saying, well, I'm actually the guardian of Christianity, the Third Rome as an idea. And if he succeeds in Ukraine, he would probably start spreading this narrative again. And what's important to remember is that it's, of course, all wrong, including narratives about, for example, the traditional family. I mean, there's nothing worse you can do to families than starting a war and killing civilians, bombing maternity wards, etc. But of course, it's also wrong if we look simply at the statistics in Russia. The number of abortions is very high, especially compared to so-called decadent Western Europe. We are seeing the huge spike in HIV, which is all reflective of a failure of Russia to care for its citizens and to actually live those values that he is professing to pursue. And the second thing is that if Russia is successful, and that's another lesson, of course, from history, is that nothing succeeds like success. So one of the reasons why Mussolini in the 1920s was making fascism popular was that he had a number of seeming successes leading up all the way to the restarting the economy, tackling the Great Depression, etc. So fascist regimes were seen as doing those kind of things very successfully. That was a lie that was an obvious lie in the 1930s and 40s, but it would also be a lie today.
That's very interesting. It's fascinating you bring up that example because it's been something on my mind recently, which is what if, in a sense, Russia is Italy in the 1930s, and that this is its campaigns in Africa, what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, and actually it's China that is Germany as opposed to Germany in being Russia in that historical example. Now, of course, as you say, Thomas, it's very, very hard to make those kind of comparisons. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. But those parallels are interesting. I just wonder, as a final question, whether you have any thoughts on that, whether actually this is something far bigger than just being about the individual situation and tragedy we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine, but actually this could be seen in the long view of history as the beginning of a great shift.
I'm afraid you have a point. Again, the example from history is it's striking just how many right-wing movements there were in the 1920s and 30s. So it's not just Italy and Germany, it's also Salazar in Portugal, Franco in Spain. We have in Central and Eastern Europe a number of fascist or semi-fascist movements in Romania, in Croatia, etc. And these movements all fed on each other in the sense that they had a model to emulate, and also that they could use the successes of one group of fascists as a model for their own or as a advertisement piece. And I think the positive answer would be that it's also true for democracies, that their success can breed further success. If we are recalling the reconstruction of Europe after 1945, the establishment of the Bretton Woods order, the prosperity and peace and stability that Europe, or I would have to say Western Europe, has enjoyed after 1945, the freedom also in Central and Eastern Europe after 1990. There are a lot of success stories that democracies can tell. And I think part of the task of tackling Russianism or the appeal of authoritarian strongmen is to make clear that there are a lot of success stories that liberal democracy can tell, including, of course, the huge success story of giving freedom to anyone, regardless of his sex, gender, etc.
Well, thank you very, very much, Thomas, for your time today. And as I say to listeners, if you're interested in reading the essay that Thomas has written, we will have the link in the show notes. There's also another piece going up today by Carolina Hurd, who will be familiar to listeners from the Institute for the Study of War. And she's writing about the ramifications for the Ukrainian people if Putin wins, which, of course, is, well, not hard to imagine, as we've talked about in the past. But thank you very much, Thomas Clausen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you, Francis, as well. Well, let's go to our next guests, Karyn, Gershon and Vlada Nedak. Let's start just with a broad overview then. Karyn and Vlada, would you tell us about Project Kesher and how you came to operate and the kind of work you do in Ukraine? Karyn, why don't you go first?
Good morning from New York. I joined Project Kesher back in 1994. It was founded in 1989, almost ironically now, by a peace activist, Sally Gratch, who was concerned about the state of the relationship between the United States and the countries of the former Soviet Union. The initial plans were to focus on the building of Jewish life, advancing the status of women, and promoting civil society. And as issues started to grow in the Jewish women's community around issues like women's health and domestic violence, increasingly we began to form interfaith coalitions of women throughout Ukraine to address some of these issues. I think that one of the things that was most interesting to us was that we found Ukraine incredibly receptive, although we were working in other countries at the time, including Russia and Belarus, in a way that was very surprising to us. Whatever communities we went to, we quickly found local government support from the local school institutions. And so by 2014, when the Revolution of Dignity took place, we knew that Ukraine was moving in a very different direction from the other countries where we worked. And we basically doubled down on our investment in Ukraine. And the additional shift, of course, took place in February 2022 when Russia escalated the war in Ukraine.
Greetings from Ukraine. My name is Vlada Nedak, and I am CEO of Project Kesher Ukraine. I am physically originally from Kryvyi Rih, which is Dnipropetrovsk region, just 80 kilometers from active war zone. I have 2 offices right now of Women's Opportunity Fund. It's our Charitable Foundation organization, which was launched in April 2022 to react immediately on humanitarian crisis because of escalation of the war with Russia. And I also lead all Ukrainian women's Jewish organization who cooperate with all Jewish communities, who works through women's leadership. And I just wanted to share that our large projects, which support not only humanitarian needs as products and stuff for mothers, newborns, babies in the region. We also have great projects who invest in small business of women all over Ukraine. During almost 2 years, we invested in 110 small businesses with the amount of money like $1,000, $1,500. And we help women to buy equipment. It's mostly women with displaced status who just left everything in occupied territories. But before they had great experience in business, at least 10 years of family business or private business. And they were ready to restart the new way of living condition in the new cities. And in half a year, we see how we really influence on the economic conditions of the families.
Another question from me really is if you could just speak a little bit more about the specific challenges and issues that women in Ukraine face after 2 years of war. I think that's an important point to make.
First of all, you should understand that women leads and now take the position of most of the different kind of profession. I'm originally from industrial city, Kryvyi Rih, which has the biggest number of factories. And for the first in the history, for example, we have a woman who leads the position of career officer, career manager. It's specific mining or industry. All my family was involved and it always was male business. Now we see that the women is taken the lead position, the middle position. It's one of the options. The next one, it's what I see that the women also taking care about mental health of themselves and the kids. I live in the region where the number of sirens at least 7 times a day. It means that no attending on school. Everyone is crying today because it's the last day of school, and the teenagers who graduate and those one who finish the first grade, they can't attend it. They just heard siren during the moment where should sing the last call at their school. It means women should operate with their professional skills and deal with taking care of the kids. It means most of them should stay at home. It means that it's some kind of risk to make career steps and to continue to be at home with their kids. We also see that the number of the militarians, the men who back to homes, they need support, they need adaptation. And the first who will come, it's women, it's their families. And it's still the question that I say that now the woman cover all family services, starting with the kids, with her professionals, with taking care of the home, with mental health, and also making a lot of volunteer and projects in the community.
And can I ask, unless Karyn, you want to add something to that, but also how have those challenges changed over the 2 years? What kind of issues did you see at the start of the full-scale invasion? And what kind of issues do you see now?
So this is Karyn. I'll just step in for 1 second, which is most of these families do not have a lot of electrical equipment. They might have a phone, they might have a computer. And so what we're seeing now is that the families are really, really burning out, because in a household where the kids are in school remotely and the moms are supporting them and really can't leave the home for long periods of time, they have to have access to shelters. We're looking very seriously at how to get laptops into the hands of more women. And it's just a very expensive project for a small organization like ours. But we could see the potential of getting thousands of laptops into these households so that more and more women could work remotely. And as the war progresses, on the one hand, we have a lot of women being given larger and larger positions of power. But for the average woman in Ukraine, the amount of time that they have to spend just holding down the fort with kids on computers, studying remotely, and when possible, to try to do some kind of remote career, it's just been really draining. And so we're just seeing people really burned out.
Thank you, Karyn. Vlada, would you like to add anything to that, just on how the demands and challenges have changed?
Sure. I joined the organization when I was 20 years old student, and I did mostly very cultural project, women project, gender-based project. I have never experienced something to react emergency, and now we are deal with a financial kind of support. We are doing humanitarian aid, and just because of our 30 years of presence in the region, of great relationship, both on state level, on regional level, because we operate in 17 regional centers, we could do it immediately. One of the projects we didn't cover, it's e-bikes for nurses. We recognize that the nurses and the medical close to the front line zone absolutely have no access to any kind of machines in the villages and in the countryside. And now we operate with 150 e-bikes, which will help to make the distance in 8 kilometers to one patient and to do it in 15, 20 minutes with e-bike. It means that I jumped from a very cultural project doing mostly with Jewish and women's projects, and now we operate as one of very meaningful organization, Charitable Foundation. It gives us understanding of new problems which women face every day.
Thank you both very much for your time. This is Francis. I just want to ask a couple of questions, if I may. The first is, I just find the statistic that women are opening more than 50% of the new businesses in Ukraine extraordinary. Not surprising, but still, I think that the starkness of that will surprise many people. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the challenges of starting a business in Ukraine at the moment in a time of war. Is it especially difficult, or is it actually something that is being actively promoted and encouraged by the government at the moment?
I just want to mention that because of the very easy system of registration and because of the number of programming which help to explain how to do this, why it should be done, and the taxes people will pay with their different kind of group of businesses is not really big one. And especially it took the very active position of the generation 20s, 30s and 40s to start business, to work openly, to pay taxes and to register officially. So we as a Charitable Foundation, we have two consultants, a lawyer consultant and accountant consultant, but they are both part of a governmental system, which you maybe Dia Business, which is huge online programming, and it took you 2 days to register and to open the account. But we help to understand the next steps, to understand how to deal with business. If you have the new customers, for example, in Europe, or you are growing up, which kind of next level of grants you can supply in Ukraine. I understand that it's from one side, the state program, which works great. And from another side, it's not the spirit, it's some kind of the next level of minding of Ukrainians to everything they did, like we say, at home, to do it officially, to do it right, to do it with condition, with marks, very professionally. And just several examples. We have women's small businesses, which cover all different kind of interesting. For example, we have a consultant business We have those who produce farmers. We have women who do services with kids. It's one of the most popular because if the region is not covered with offline education, if it's more difficult, people try to organize kids in some kind of gathering outside of the home. We have the cosmetic business, we have clothes business, bakery studios, services for the women, for the family, all the variety of business.
Thank you. And just one final question from me, which is, of course, as the war has gone on, there is still a very much a strong focus on what is happening. But I have understood from speaking to other people who work with charities that, of course, it's become more difficult in getting funding. I just wonder if you found that experience or whether there remains still a lot of support for your work.
So this is Karyn. So we actually just got the largest grant in our history, which was $1.5 million to do the work for the next several months. And I think that what we're really committed to, because I do think the potential continues to exist that funding will decrease, is that from our perspective, we really want to ensure that women are considered very strongly as the government aid packages are created by each country so that the standards for getting loans and access to grants is not limited to larger organizations, larger companies, which are often not the ones that women are starting. So we're trying to have conversations with USAID and other organizations to ensure that we can demonstrate that there is a real impact of investing in these small women-owned businesses so that they become large enough for these larger granting and loan programs that are often coming out of the government.
Thank you so much, Thomas, Francis, Vlada and Karyn. Coming up, Francis and Vlada's final thoughts. Well, thank you so much, Karyn and Vlada, for your time today. Let's move towards our final thoughts, then we'll come back to both of you for your final thoughts. But Francis Dearnley, would you like to go first?
Thanks, David. We referenced the 1930s in our conversation with Thomas earlier, and as listeners will know, I'm currently reading Winston Churchill's history of the Second World War, and a couple more quotes jumped out from me when reading the first volume, The Gathering Storm, where he describes in detail the 1930s, and his description of the political zeitgeist felt disturbingly apt for the present day. So to quote Mr. Churchill, or Sir Winston, as I should accurately call him, "We must regard as deeply blameworthy before history the conduct of political parties both in and out of office during this fatal period. Delight in smooth-sounding platitudes, refusal to face unpleasant facts, desire for popularity and electoral success irrespective of the vital interests of the state, genuine love of peace and pathetic belief that love can be its sole foundation, obvious lack of intellectual vigour in its leaders, marked ignorance of Europe and aversion from its problems in the right, the strong and violent pacifism which at this time dominated the left, the utter devotion of liberals to sentiment apart from reality, supported by overwhelming majorities in electoral parties. All of these constituted a picture of fatuity and fecklessness which, though devoid of guile, was not devoid of guilt, and though free from wickedness or evil design, played a definite part in the unleashing upon the world of horrors and miseries beyond comparison in human experience." And then later on, he just talks a little bit more about Britain and the failures of its political class in this period. "It would be wrong in judging the policy not to remember the passionate desire for peace which animated political parties at this time. Misinformed majorities that seemed to threaten with political extinction any party or politician who dared to take any other line. This, of course, is no excuse for political leaders who fall short of their duty. It is much better for parties or politicians to be turned out of office than to imperil the life of the nation. Moreover, there is no record in our history of any government asking Parliament and the people for the necessary measures of defence being refused." So, Winston Churchill offering some interesting reflections on the political environment of the 1930s, which, as I say, feels worryingly similar to our own in many respects.
Thank you very much, Francis. Vlada, as our guest, would you like the very final words?
Sure. I just want to thank you for just being heard, a female voice from Ukraine. And I also wanted to mention that one of the topics is always covered. It's the topic about anti-Semitism in Ukraine, which is, we know that absolutely untruth. I'm the person who lead informal Jewish education for years. Now we came to the translation of Jewish text and praise into Ukrainian. And for the first time of the history, we printed the first Haggadah, which is used for Pesach this April, and we spread it all over Ukraine in Jewish communities, and we sent it to President Zelensky. I mean that the Jewish community these days continue to be in Ukraine to life, and these days we are bringing Torah from United States to Kiev Hillel Students Organization, just to have opportunity to the youth make celebration. That's my last sentence. I just want to add to make the feeling that the life continues, the life of women and families continues in Ukraine, and the Jewish life of Jewish Ukrainians' life continues in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Vlada, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.